And so that's the book we're going to be talking about today. And to start us off, Brian's going to be showing a couple of images and just talking a little bit about them.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Jessica and Jennifer, for the warm words. And I know that Jessica is going to put up some slides on the screen soon, and I'll walk you through those. Before she does, or as she does, I also want to give a big shout out to Literary Arts and Susan, and again, Jessica and their whole team for having this event, and then to the wonderful Jennifer, who has shaped some amazing questions for today and is a great poet in her own right. So please check out her work as well. So whenever you're ready, Jessica, I think she is loading up some slides. And you should all be able to see on your screens the front cover of the book. We just wanted you to have a close-up view. My mother, Renko Ishida Dempster, her artist name is Sui Ren. She did this beautiful painting, and we agreed after looking through hundreds of her paintings that this would be the cover image for the book. As you can see, it's an abstract image, but it evokes many of the themes, obviously the idea of a seizure, of epilepsy, but also images such as fire, such as a forest, such as blood, and you can imagine other things as well. And these are things that are evoked in the poems. So the next slide, I thought it would be nice for you as audience. Jennifer and I were thinking about what would make this interview engaging for you as an audience. And one thing besides the Q&A is to also introduce you to some of my life. And these are, obviously the main characters in the book are based upon me. And that's a younger me. And that's my son when he was around 1 year old, we're guessing, at our family cabin. And the whole book Seas is about a father-son relationship, which I'll talk about more later. And it's about the complicated nature of that connection. The final slide is a close-up of Brendan. He's a little bit older here. It's on when, many of our trips to the hospital were related to his epilepsy. And the trips blur together in my mind. But this picture is really, to me, a precious one, a poignant one. I look at my son and see strength, I see peace, and I see calm. And I don't remember this exactly for sure, but I believe this is after he is recovering from a bout of seizures, and there he is in his hospital gown. So as we talk today, and I talk about the speaker, and I talk about Brendan, this is some of the autobiographical material I drew from, as well as my own imagination and creative license. Thank you so much, Jessica. And now, Jennifer, whenever you're ready, I'd love to start our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for sharing those images. I think it's a great way for us to start talking about what some of the poems in the book look like visually. I think in having these readings, especially over Zoom, instead of maybe being physically present at Literary Arts or in a bookstore where people could browse through the book and take a look at it, it's sometimes hard to convey that visual element of poetry, which is always so important to the poems.
Yes.
And in reading your book, I really was attentive to the shape of so many of the poems, that you use these kind of staggered lines that move across the field of the page. You often use very short stanzas of just one or two lines. And I was wondering if you could talk about just some of those formal choices and how that intersects with the thematic and emotional kind of territory that you're exploring in the book.
What a tremendous question. Thank you. And for my mother as a visual artist, this is something she contends with all the time, the relationship between space and image, as poet between, the word and the white space of the page. For me, in terms of Seas, I'm going to look at Topaz, my first book, as a counterpoint. Topaz had poems that I felt were pretty dense. They were more packed and compressed. And what I mean by that, there was less space between the lines. There was a move towards urgency and longer lines, speeding the action along. And that did feel intuitive. It wasn't like I sat down and attempted that. It just felt like the way to form those poems. And it's one continuous quest of the speaker to try to piece together the fragments of the Japanese American camp experience, and then how that relates to the integration of identity and other issues. With C's, as I wrote it, I felt that my intuition was drawing me to a different place. And the poems felt too intense to be that compressed and compacted. And I'm not sure why, but my guess and my speculation has to do with the theme and the content, which is number one, epilepsy. I haven't had a seizure, but I've witnessed my son have one. And I believe it must be a very fragmented, nonlinear experience. It must be dislocating. And I imagine that just like the camp experience, those fragments of history, that memory or experience becomes very fragmented. And so, in terms of the short lines and the space, I thought about bending time, bending consciousness, and at the same time, giving the reader more breathing room to take in the intensity of the events of the experience. Epilepsy, Japanese incarceration, racial and homophobic violence, these have an inherent urgency and volatility and charge to the topics. And my intuition drew me into more open white space. I joked with you when we spoke earlier. I was afraid when I saw the book published. It was 150 pages long, and audience and readers, do not be afraid. There is a lot of white space in there. And so I don't think it feels the length that it actually is. But that's more testament to how much spacing there is. Did I capture everything in terms of your question? Do you want me to add anything you can think of?
Yeah, I thought that was great. That was definitely my experience as a reader, where because some of the poems are either they're intense, or some of them just because the experience is one that I've not had before and want to take my time with to understand better. So having that open space allowed me to sit with the poem in a way that I imagine it wouldn't have if it was more visually compressed.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, and I don't know how well this is going to show up, that there are some poems in C's that also return more to the topaz form, but they're more contrast points to the poems that Jennifer was talking about. And so I would say that I'm also trying to create juxtaposition between some of the slower pacing and the more urgent pacing. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but here's one example. I guess you have to buy the book to really see it. But anyway, if you look closely, you can see kind of that spacing and the asterisks, and that's some of the formatting that I did. The sections also have well, not asterisks, but kind of not, they don't have numbers. And the section breaks have a breathing space too. So yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful question. It was really helpful actually that you asked that, because it allowed me to articulate why I made those choices.
Sure. And I dropped a link in the chat too. It looked like Truce was the poem that you were holding up, and
Yeah,
Truce was published by Tri-Quarterly Online. So if people want to look and be able to be off screen and kind of taking a look at how that's laid out on the page, you could get a sense from that.
thank you.
Do you want to read a poem I know that you were talking about that sense of
Yeah,
fragmentation, and
yeah, yeah.
gives me
So
sense of that.
Jennifer and I thought it would be nice for you as an audience if I wove in a couple of poems throughout our conversation that were relevant to what we were talking about. And the poem that we decided would be really appropriate for this first one is Seized. That's Seized. And it's in these staccato phrases and fragments. And it gives that sense of fragmentation, but then you'll notice that there's some elongation as the poem goes. And I want to mention that, like Truce, this is a poem that converges the epileptic condition of my son Brendan with the historical seizure of my mother Renko and her maternal relatives, or I should say my maternal relatives during World War II in Topaz prison camp. So the reference to 1942 is referring to at the time they were taken away. It's called seized. By day, by night, in handcuffs, through mind scramble, brain surged, shock of force, body taut, alerted, taken, outside, inside, anytime, any place, no words to explain. My infant mother, 1942, my young son now, the rug, his twisted body, his world inside. And what it does, red flare or white lightning, fried impulse or smoldering heat, a searing of gray or glitter of stars veiled by fog. Her fragments, yellow orb the porch light, shimmer against her face. The cradle, her mother's arms, a blanket's false cover, itch of wool, hives on skin. Things just happen, by bus, by train, by war, electric storms, a horse stable, desert, sand swirl and mind gust, thought sparks, word cloudings, mountains spike against white. A guard's boot, trodden syllable, a thorned cage, wing pierced, baby hawk in wire, my barbed string of words, to capture him, capture her. If he never speaks, I carry him. If she cries for her father, grandmother carries her. Someplace, my mother carries what is unremembered, begins to know when I ask. I don't speak of things I can't know, of despair about my son. We never know where we are going, where love will end us.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
So one of the things that you mentioned in as a preface to reading that poem was the sort of interweaving of not just the sort of parent-child relationship, but also this historical relationship. And one of the things that I noticed as I was reading your book in connection to both of those aspects is the power of language, or the capacity for language to do harm.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of poems where there's this sort of accusatory language that the father has either spoken or at least thought.
Yeah.
And there's a comparison of that to bullying. And
Mhm.
in other poems, I think of the poem Jap, where there's an overt connection between violence and language, where that word, that slur of the title, it's described as being shot out of the neighbor's mouth and riding the ear and clipping the. And I'm curious if you could talk to us a little bit about why that aspect of language that's potential to do harm became such a presence in the book, and how you use that to make connections among these different kinds of situations where it comes up.
Yeah, I think all of you audience members can tell that Jennifer has really thought deeply about the book, and I'm so honored to be thinking about such incredible questions. I think as a poet, we work in the medium of language, and so there's this ars poetica form where you write poems about language as you're writing the poem, and it's very self-reflective. But in my case, that obsession is sprinkled throughout the book, and I do think that I'm a rhetoric and language professor, so part of it is the profession. I've seen the ways in which language can be weaponized as a tool of propaganda, as evidenced by the Japanese American wartime incarceration. For example, calling imprisonment relocation using euphemisms. As a young boy, I wasn't aware of it, and in adolescence, but I was witness to toxic masculinity and the use of words as weapons. And so all of that, I think, again, as with the content informed question, I didn't set out because I didn't want it to be polemic and preachy, but my intuition drew me towards these themes. And in the poem A Boy, which is early in the book that you're referring to, it's really an admission of the wrongdoing boys do to other boys and how bullying and intimidation and picking on other boys is an unfortunate part of growing up. And words like sissy and more disturbing words in that version are used as a way to demean. And to have grown up with that and then to now have a special needs son who one day could be the subject of bullying. Brendan is nonverbal. He, as I said, is epileptic. He also has cerebral palsy. And so for him to defend himself in some ways is difficult, if not possible, right? Because, I saw how kids of his nature were treated when I was younger. And there's a stigmatization that's both conscious and unconscious that occurs. So that poem is about the speaker implicating, in a sense, himself into a wrongdoing of the past and then attempting to redeem it later in the poem by giving a new language for his son and refusing to see the son in those non-normative terms or slur words and using words like broken bird or actually waking bird. I revised it to, and fierce starling as a way to have a more tender rhetoric and language that is counter to that language. And shortly, I'll talk about Jap, which is later in the section. You correctly pointed out, right, that this word comes alive. It's almost like personified. It has an energy in charge of its own. And that's how I wrote the poem. I wrote it as if the word itself is a bullet shot right out of the neighbor's mouth, Mr. F. And you feel that violence in what he says. And it's an acknowledgement of the ways in which words perpetuate racism. But at the same time, I tried to paint shades of gray into his character, show his skill as a gardener, him giving tomatoes to my mother. Also, my father's quiet strength in rebuking Mr. F. So it's both portrayal of racism vis-a-vis language, also a opposition to it, and also a look at where did that come from. Mr. F is a war veteran, is one who assimilated those messages through actually fighting in the military. And so these things are not simple, they're complicated. And my poems do not want to judge, but rather portray and then let the reader interpret.
Yeah, it strikes me as you were talking about the trying to portray that Mr. F as being this complex, rounded human being. That poem ends with shrapnel from his war embedded in parts of me. And it occurred to me as you said that, well, of course, the shrapnel metaphorically or literally is embedded in him too, right? That he received violence and he is continuing to carry out violence. And that seems like such a parallel with the sort of toxic masculinity culture that we spoke about in relationship to A Boy, where, one person receives this harmful idea of manhood and then perpetuates it upon others unless they take the intervention to stop doing it.
Well, that's very elegantly said. And as you said that, I even thought shrapnel from his war is also the camps, right? And so even though it was his war and he fought in it, he may not even be aware of the ways in which the shrapnel of the camps is also linked to that. And one thing I want to say historically that's important, during World War II, the Japanese abroad and the Japanese Americans were wrongly conflated. And that's what led to the incarceration in the first place. And that's what would lead to someone saying Jap, because the inability to make that distinction between Japanese who were born in America and who were citizens, and the Japanese abroad who were caricatured as kamikazes and never surrender, never say die. If you see those propaganda films, it's quite disturbing. And so the conflation of the other into this one homogenous body is the other kind of complicated subtext, I think, behind that particular poem and others. And also the shrapnel, I think, covers a lot of that, right? That image itself has a lot of resonance with some of what you're saying too.
Yeah, I can see that. To continue on this idea of the ways in which um, incarceration and that historical incarceration and the sort of more contemporary, father-son relationship are woven together in the book. I noticed that in several of the poems, you reference an inability to speak, and I thought it was revealing. It was telling about my own assumptions that I assumed it would be that would come up in reference to Brendan's verbal
Mm.
abilities. But more often, I noticed that it would come up in relationship to the narrator not having the words to say something. And in that poem you just read, Seized, there's a line about, I don't speak of things I can't know, of despair about my son.
Yeah.
And then in other poems where it speaks about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, there's
Mhm.
a space there in some of those poems where the narrator's expressing a desire to learn about that, and the mother in those poems is saying, sort of, I don't quite remember, and can offer some images of it, but can't give this sort of coherent, complete sense
Yeah.
that the narrator seems to be after.
Mhm.
And I was curious about what made you decide to focus on those moments where language feels like it's falling short,
Yeah.
and especially in relationship to these things like reckoning with historical trauma, with complicated human emotion.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. That's so brilliant what you're saying. I like that you're seeing the poems that way. That was my intention after writing the book. I hoped that that would come across. And certainly there's a historical piece of it that I've talked about and that you're mentioning, but I want to add another layer, which is that my mother was too young to remember. And so her inability to articulate has more to do with an actual challenge in retrieving the memories and not knowing what is real, what is imagined. Then we had others in my family who remember it, but the shame or the trauma of speaking about it was too much to bear. And it's not that they consciously told me that, it's that I sensed it. And then there were others in the family who spoke about it freely. And so there was this whole continuum. And that really is something I noticed growing up, that it wasn't simple. There's also this cultural value with the Japanese Americans of trying to protect the younger generation through their silence by not reintroducing them to the trauma. And we probably see parallels with things like the Holocaust and that type of protection to the younger generation. So there's the history piece. But then I unexpectedly have a boy who is nonverbal, and he literally is trapped in terms of not being able to express himself through our normative language. That gravitated immediately to a connection with the historical silences. And not only that, what I realized is that my normative language had such a limitation in reaching my son because that wasn't his modality. Now he understands more and more as he gets older, really smart, high level of receptive understanding. But imagine as a poet for us not being able to have language, that we rely on it. It's all we have. He opened my eyes to the fact that language is complex. It's not just, you know, the written English language, it's body language. It's the way he touches me on the wrist or taps me when he shows his love or tenderness. It's the way that he grabs me harder when he's afraid. It's the way that his eyes, the ways in which he does or does not make eye contact are imparting meaning. And so what I realized is that attending to language became much more dimensional after I had him, and that there's all these different forms of language that we sometimes forget about. Just like when we tell our writing students, don't just write images, think about the auditory, think about the tactile, think about, the multi-sensory experience. Well, what if we thought about language that way, in that sort of multi-dimensional tapestry framework? And so obviously as a poet, I believe in the power of language. I'm invested, I'm committed, And poetry is incredible at transforming experience, at raising social consciousness. And I will always use it. I'm committed, but I do have to acknowledge the limitations. And it's not just in these ways, but if you look at our current climate in America today, we can't just write poems. We have to act, we have to educate, we have to do everything we can as citizens, not just literary citizens, but citizens, in order to advance the causes that we write about. And so poetry is one powerful force of I think a larger consciousness in our own identities that can forward our own visions and missions.
Yeah, there was something in what you said just there that reminded me of Toni Morrison. I think I can't remember if it was in her Nobel lecture, but where she talks about how language can't, can't tackle war or genocide, and it
Yeah,
shouldn't try to, but
yeah,
that in reaching toward, attempting to, it's reach toward the ineffable. That's the thing that it's the space that it's given. And there's something about the way
yeah,
you described, communication and learning to communicate through whatever Brendan's language is, which might seem ineffable to those of us who are used to using a certain kind of language, but to him, it's normal and normative.
yeah, yeah. And I have a line in a poem later in the book called James Bird, and it says, "This is just a poem, the search for words." And I see that as in a way, a thesis statement that resonates with what Toni Morrison said, that as poets and writers and artists, right, in all genres, that we carry out this vision and we hope to create social change through it. There's a frustration though, because we know it's not enough. The poem I wrote can't bring back James Bird. The poems we write can't bring back George Floyd, but at least they can give voice to it and shape that experience so that as many people know about it as possible, and that we are not silenced by those who attempt to silence us.
Since you mentioned that poem about James Bird, there's this sequence of poems in the book that are all dedicated to people who have been murdered, particularly through acts of anti-Black and anti-gay violence. There's one about Oscar Grant, one about James Bird, one about Matthew Shepard. And those poems were really striking to me because of the other kind of interweaving that you were doing in the book, between the sort of personal, the historical, the familial, and then it brings in these other people in their lives to whom maybe there's not that very direct connection, but there still is an important thread that's connecting all of these other experiences to the violence and to the lives of the people that you're dedicating those poems to. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the choice to bring their presence into the book.
Yeah. Well, I know some of the members of my writing group are here today, and I'm just in the chat occasionally things are popping up. So I know Caroline and Lily and there's probably others, but I remember when I was putting the manuscript together and sharing it with my writing group and editing partner Anastasia and my editor, I had to consider that for Martha Rhodes, my stellar editor at Four Way. And the big question was this: is this going to be a book just about Brendan and me, about a father and son journey, about my sense to understand my boy and to, you know, really, really reconcile him in all his dimensionality? Or were there other themes and were there other issues that were going to gravitate around that orbit? And for the most part, people encouraged me towards what my gut told me, which was to complicate it. And of course, I was in a sense biasing them because I'd say, hey, don't you think it'd be a good idea if? And they'd say, well, yeah, that sounds cool, right? But when you talk about the James Bird, Oscar Grant, and Shepherd Psalm poems later in the book, if you think about the term seize or seizure, there's this physical, psychological component, there's the medical component. And that became an umbrella concept by which I could decide which poems were relevant. And through our conversation today, right, it makes me feel that the choice was affirmed, that what happened to Brendan cannot be separated to what happened to these people, even if it's distinct, even if it's different. We are bound through space and time through this metaphor of seizure. And later in the book, I attempt to, well, I'd say throughout the book, but especially later, I attempt to transform that towards agency and empowerment. We seize back our experience by owning it, by acknowledging it, and by transforming it. And so it's not a passive process. So I hope that answers your question, but essentially it was like the through line was Brendan, and around that through line swirled and revolved Japanese American history, forms of violence that you mentioned, and also PTSD of war veterans and other issues as well.
Yeah, I thought uh, it was striking the way that those different kinds of marginalized experiences, or experiences that don't get as much attention in dominant narratives, were represented, and that they also were represented with a kind of nuance to say, especially in that sequence, that series of those
Yeah.
three poems, that it was not, the voice was different than in the other poems, where you weren't speaking, or the poems weren't speaking from the space of like authorial knowledge of this is what happens. It was more questioning and
Yeah.
hoping for something different, or even naming outright, that this is just a poem. Sort of the struggle with
Mhm.
knowing that, with attempting to write about this, and again, kind of acknowledging that maybe language falls short
Right.
in some ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's well put, Jennifer. Um, so I do see that it's 4:40, and I was thinking we had talked, yesterday, we want to leave some time for Q&A. So maybe would this be a time to read a poem or two and then transition to Q&A, do you think? What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, if you'd like to read a few poems, that would be great. So far, there aren't any questions in the Q&A tab, but if any appear in the next few minutes, we can talk through those too.
Okay, that sounds good. So what I'll do, and this is just for you, the audience, to get just a sense of the arc of the book. And obviously, in reading a poem or two here, I just want you to get a sense of some of the main themes and shapes. So I'm going to read the Shepherd Psalm poem because Jennifer and I just talked about it. Then I think I'll close with Broken, and then I can summarize maybe what the last section is about. And then we could just go to a short Q&A, and that'll give us probably about 10 minutes for Q&A or so. So Shepherd Psalm, look up Matthew Shepard if you haven't heard about this. It happened, I think, in 1998. And he was a victim of anti-gay violence, as Jennifer pointed out. And his death and James Byrd's led to hate crime legislation, thankfully. But his story haunted me, and it still haunts me to this day, about what happened to him in Laramie, Wyoming. And this poem is, in a sense, an invocation to his spirit. And it's after Psalm 23. Shepherd's Psalm is the title. Prepare for enemies. Warm your feet from dirt's grave cold. Uncover your voice. The words flying out like leaves into gusts of their rage. Dissolve the fist stain on your face and the rope around your wrists. Lie down in the beaten dark, near pastures green and unbruised, the salt raining down your blood, restoring dusk's ragged edge to smooth plains of terracotta slate. your gold straw hair igniting the wick of pink dawn. You shall not want. And I'll close with this poem. I think Broken is a good one. I think it's in the third section of the book, right after Shepherd's Psalm. And it looks at how does having a special needs son like Brendan affect the relationship with my partner, Grace, the triangle of our family, which is now a square with our rescue dog, Bo, but it was a triangle at the time I wrote this poem. And in this poem, Broken, it's really inspired by the many nights that we went to hospitals with Brendan and the enduring strength and beauty and radiance of marriage, but how that gets tested and challenged in these moments. It's called Broken. The park below gives us fire, orange leaves crackling over green. I gulped coffee as I drove. Grace held the cold cloth on his head. I do, he babbled his mantra. Our mouths chalked, minds chipped and torn away. He never gets better, I said. Her lips tightened. That doesn't help us. Back to our corners. Another night in ER. 2 bags of fluids through our 8-year-old son. A flock sweeps over, shadows the flame, spiking mercury. The night cracked into ice chips, his skin paling, seizing, stopped. Some couples like us end up broken, Grace says, rubs my back. Not us, I tell her, my hand on his chest as he sleeps. Through the window, I see kids swinging into the sky, gulls rising, wings white as Brendan's shirt, the silk of Grace's gown. The long field flickering, she leans against me, our forms resting with his in glass. A whole life of I do, I do.
Thank you for reading those, Brian. I
Thank you.
wondered if, since we still have a little bit of time and there aren't any questions in the Q&A, would you like to read something from the final section of the book as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thank you. So I think a good poem for the new year is The Miracle in Our Orbit. You know, Brendan is about to turn 16, and several years ago during a flood in the Bay Area, California, where I live, right around his birthday, we were all sitting around the table and something happened that I had to write a poem about. And this is the recording of our little miracle. It's called Brendan's I Am. A close flash, quick torrent, the sounding near. It happened in time. The path deepened, water reached the house. Our son, 14, walked alone to his blue stroller chair. Wheels locked, we strapped him in, his body still as Buddha beneath the tree. I steadied the bowl. Grace raised the spoon of broth to his lips. Her words, Brendan, we just want you to have a happy life. Silver touches his tongue. 2 syllables gush from his mouth. Rain gathers, our eyes close, the current flows through us. His first real sentence, I am. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. I love that poem.
Well,
I loved reading your book, but that poem, it comes fairly close to the end, and it just feels like such a I don't know, culminating moment for so many of the things in the book.
yeah, and I was just talking to my parents the other day. You know, probably like a lot of you in the audience, all of us, we FaceTime our loved ones these days. We Zoom with them. And, I miss my parents and family and brother and friends so much. And what my parents do, Stuart and Renko, they're such great grandparents. They read him stories and he sits on our bed, which is called the clubhouse now. And they were saying, how long did it take for him to say I am when you said we just want you to have a happy life, when Grace said that? And it was like my memory was only like 2 or 3 seconds, right? And then I started to try to get him to do it again. I'm like, Brendan, say the I am again, because we know he said it. It was so clear, and he hasn't said it yet again, but I know it's in there. And it was just this incredible moment where it reminded me we cannot underestimate him. And, like I'll say stuff like, Brendan, get me your shoes. He brings me his shoes. Brendan, get me the blue Nikes. He brings me his blue Nikes. Brendan, get me the car keys. Yeah, and so when I say his receptive understanding is really high and that he's an extremely intelligent kid, you really, in those moments of I am, like I call them the I am moments, it's like he's asserting his agency through his own language and through his own gestures and through his own modality. And it's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Thank you for being willing to share your experience of parenting and your experience of Brendan with us, both through the poems and through this conversation. We did get one question in the chat, and I think it would be a good one to close us out on.
Okay.
There's someone who writes that they're a grandmother of a special needs, beautiful boy, and they were wondering how this process of writing poetry about your son has helped you make sense of your life.
Wow. That is a fantastic question to close on, isn't it? Let me have that sink in just for a moment. So she's a grandmother of a special needs boy. Did I hear that
Mhm.
correctly? So it's kind of like my mother, right? It's the same perspective. Well, in terms of the process, Brendan was really diagnosed. We were first-time parents and we didn't know anything was quote unquote wrong at first. And then when he didn't hit milestones, some of our close, relatives and family members said something very sensitively to us. And, after he was diagnosed, that was a shock to the system. And probably all of us are somehow in the audience connected to someone with a disability, even if it's not directly in our own family. So that shock to the system led to some involuntary writing, some catharsis, and some poetic drafts that poured out of me. And they were pretty raw, they were pretty intense, they were uncensored and unmediated on purpose. And they were a way, I think, to get the shock, at least processing. And then over the long course of writing the book, which yeah, it was over 14-year process because I wrote the first draft maybe in 2006. So what I would say is that I realized writing the poems was bringing me to greater understanding of my own life. And I didn't want to write them in a selfish sense, but it was just something that I realized that it was not a way to only process, but it was a way for me to appreciate and honor and have gratitude for my son. It was also a way for me to admit my own flaws. And so it was a deeply vulnerable process, but I felt artistically responsible to it. And it was just for this very moment in time we're in right now, for this question that is being asked. I wanted it to reach others with special needs children, really all parents, right? I mean, all parents know the difficulty of raising a child. But for those with special needs parents, grandparents included, and family members, I wanted them to know that there was work in the world that resonated and could give voice to our collective experience despite the differences, so that one did not feel isolated and one felt that there's a way to hopefully empower and transform the experience, which is what the arc of my book tries to do. Begin in a sort of crisis in media res, negotiate and explore that, and then resolve into poems like Brendan's I Am. And for me, that would be the hope that that is the arc of our real lives as special needs parents. Because if it's not the arc, then we're doing a disservice to our children like Brendan. And we cannot fall prey to the stigmas towards disabilities, the prejudice towards those who are marginalized. And in terms of writing the book, it really got me deeply in touch with that core of myself that is fiercely protective of Brendan, but at the same time, admitting my shame and guilt about having a child that was not normal and figuring out a way to reconcile that. So I hope that answers your question. It's such a important one. And feel free to follow up with a question or comment if I didn't fully answer it, but I hope I got to the gist of it there.
Yeah, thank you to the person out there who asked that question. And thank you, Brian, for that answer. It struck me as you talked about your process of using writing as a way to process, to examine how you were thinking and how you're feeling, and to get that out onto the page. It I think that your work, even though it's speaking very clearly to parents, and particularly to parents or caretakers or guardians of special needs children, I think it also affirms other experiences, even for, I'm not a parent, but it did allow me to really contemplate and deeply question some of my own, beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I think you're really pointing to something that I feel is important, and that is that when we read poems, stories, experiences about those who are from marginalized, identities, not just the disabled, but anyone, that we do not pigeonhole them, that we do not put them in a sort of a pocket that, oh, that's the disabled narrative, because it's part of our experience, right? And James Joyce has this idea of we find the particular in the universal, right? The universal in the particular, that sort of notion. So my hope was that by getting into that particular space, into that really concrete space, that it would have some kind of universal resonance, right? That, you know, and I do think like the themes you brought up today and are really, I so appreciate this conversation, have really got me to see that hopefully it's gone in that direction, because you've talked about language and you've talked about the idea of trauma, you've talked about the idea of family, and these are all orbits that all of us live in, right? And so we happen to have a child who's not typical, but because he's not typical, that's the very gift that he has. And I think that it's really, really important for all of us, the next time we see a kid screaming in the parking lot or a kid doing something non-normative, that we do not have a knee-jerk reaction. And the same would go for the genre itself, that, we read widely and deeply in order to learn more about ourselves.
Thank you, Brian. Um, I'm deeply appreciative for this conversation, for reading your book. I think it's made me more attentive to myself, and to hopefully I will act with more care in the world because I've read your words. And we are about out of time. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today, for listening to Brian and his poetry. And I think Jessica might pop back on to close us out.
I just wanted to say thank you both so much. Everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, buy books, and support these amazing poets. Thank you.
Yeah, and as we close, I did want to ask Jessica if you can maybe save the chat somehow, because I didn't see any of it, and I would love to see the comments and even respond to those if there were any that wanted further response. But I really want to give some gratitude to Literary Arts as we close here. All of you, Literary Arts is an amazing organization in Portland, Oregon, and when the pandemic ends, you should go there. It is just expertly run by Susan and Andrew. And, you know, we have amazing people like Jessica, who was so helpful in putting this presentation together. But please support their events, their work. It's really incredible what they're doing. And to all of you, as we near next week and a new administration, I'm just sending warm thoughts and joy and gratitude to all of you. And I have a lot of optimism as we move towards April, May, June, that hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person. So everyone, gratitude for being here today, and everyone take good care.
Thank you.